So I'd like to make a few comments about our session that will be coming up while your dinner is being served. So first of all, let me thank Mac Taylor for providing some important information about thanks again. Thank you once again for Mac Taylor for providing some information for our conference today. And I wanted to make a few general comments about the theme of the dinner session while everybody's getting settled up here on the stage. The theme of the dinner session is new political realities. Some comments about those new political realities as we see them at the Institute. This year, America saw its third consecutive change election as voters overturned control of the House just 2 years after changing partisan control in the White House in 2008 and overturning the House once again in 2006. In California this year, the election may have had a different partisan outcome than it did nationally, but polls show that voters at both levels are equally dissatisfied with government performance. More than 3/4 of registered voters in California disapproved of their legislature's performance in a recent PPIC statewide survey, nearly identical to the number who disapproved of Congress performance in a recent national survey by the Washington Post. Large majorities showed little trust or expectation for government improvement. As the person who was conducting those polls, there was one finding in our post-election surveys that were released last week that came to my attention, which I wanted to share with you tonight. And that is that 79% of California's election voters, disapprove of the way the governor and legislature are working together in making public policy. 79%. That was a sharp increase, over double the number who held that view after the 2006 election. And in terms of how people are viewing the federal government, 71% also disapprove of the way the president and Congress are working together to make public policy. It's obviously a challenging environment for governing, but it's especially difficult because there are major issues facing leaders at both levels. Washington lawmakers are struggling to encourage a slowly recovering economy and reduce a growing federal deficit, even as partisan clashes loom over health care and fiscal policies. In Sacramento, partisan differences and voter mandates present obstacles to solving a projected $25 billion budget deficit next year, while the state faces high unemployment rates. Today, we want to talk about the challenges of governing in coming months and how policymakers can plan for the future in the current environment. We'll look at the results of the election and the closely watched expressions from Latino voters, independent voters, the Tea Party. We'll focus on the interpretations of the electorate that will influence policymakers in their upcoming decisions and shape the next elections that are already emerging. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Judy Woodruff, PBS senior correspondent and co-anchor of the PBS NewsHour. Judy is one of the most respected and well-known political journalists in the world. We're very fortunate that Judy traveled from Washington today to kick off our California's Future Conference. Judy will introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I have been fortunate to know Mark and to touch base with him generally in election years, but in some occasion off years as well. But what I want to say to all of you is that for those of us in Washington who cover California politics, and I'm not just saying this because this is a PPIC event, but this is an organization we know we can turn to for information that we can count on, and in the incredibly polarized, opinionated environment that we all swim in these days, it is beyond valuable to be able to turn to an organization, to someone like Mark and to something like PPIC, and know that the polling, the research, the analysis that they do is straight. It's something that they've done their homework. It's not tilting one way or another. Neither side may love it at one moment or another, but it's solid. And so I just want to return the compliment to you and say that when Mark contacted me a few months ago and asked if I'd come out here, I said yes. For all the times I've been able to call on you, I'm delighted to do this. And besides, as it turns out, nothing's going on in Washington right now. It was so easy to get away this week for Dan Balz and me, whom you're going to meet in just a minute. The truth is, it's really impossible to understand the American political landscape without taking the state of California into consideration. You have the largest congressional delegation. You have the largest block of presidential electoral votes. And from San Diego to Los Angeles to San Francisco, Sacramento, and name every other city, you are the state where so many trends are launched, propositions are passed, and lawsuits are filed. So one way or another, you keep the rest of the nation, you keep the rest of us on the edge of our seats. Now, you don't always vote like the rest of the country, as we saw a few weeks ago, and we do have people, I guess, with opinions in the room. Okay, and you are, I have to say, you are different from Washington in one other respect, and that is you have a legislative analyst, a budget analyst that both sides listen to and respect, and it's hard for me to think of many individuals or institutions in Washington that both political parties will put stock in. Pretty much they come to the table with their own set of facts, their own favorite analysis, if you will. So the fact that you have someone like Mac Taylor and the kind of analysis that he offered tonight, as depressing as it was, I would say at least it's someone who it's my understanding that both sides in this great divide respect the work that he's done. As I say, there's no such thing in Washington. So we have tonight an outstanding panel to lead off this discussion and to carry us through. I'm going to introduce them one by one, and then they're each going to talk to you for about 5 minutes, giving their take, meaning of the election results, what they think the prospects are for meaningful work getting done, meaningful solutions in the year to come. We're going to talk among ourselves for several minutes, 15, 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to you in the audience for your questions for the final 15 or 20 minutes. So be thinking as you're hearing from them, from us, about what you want to ask. So let me quickly get to it and introduce first, on my right, on your left, is Dan Balz, who everybody here knows as the national political correspondent for the Washington Post, where he has reported since 1978. He has covered the White House. He has been the national editor at the Post. He's written 2 books on American politics and is widely considered one of that very small handful of the most knowledgeable and most respected political journalists in the country. So please welcome Dan Balz. On my immediate left, to the right, as you look at us, Dr. Fernando Guerra. He is director of the Thomas and Dorothy Levy Center for the Study of Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University in LA. He has been on the faculty at the university since 1984 as a professor and a department chair. He has written numerous scholarly articles in his specialty area, which is state and local government and urban and ethnic politics. Please welcome Dr. Fernando Guerra. Gale Kaufman on my right, to your left, president of Kaufman Campaign. She has served as a lead consultant for more than 80 U.S. congressional, state senate, and state assembly campaigns, as well as numerous municipal and local measures, issue advocacy campaigns, and statewide ballot initiatives. She has worked for Speaker Willie Brown and has consulted with organizations across the spectrum, from business to organized labor. Please welcome Gale Kaufman. And our last panelist for this evening, to the far right as you face us, is Bill Whalen. He's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he studies current events and political trends with an emphasis on California's political landscape. He writes for Hoover Publications and California daily newspapers, as well as the Weekly Standard. He has consulted for Governor Schwarzenegger, for former Los Angeles Mayor Richard Riordan, a number of others. At one point earlier in his career, we were discussing it tonight, he worked for former Governor Pete Wilson. Please welcome Bill Whalen. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. I'm going to ask Dan Balz to begin because he's going to bring us a national perspective, and then we will turn to the other panelists. But Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Judy. Thank all of you for having us out here to talk about our favorite topics. After Mac Taylor's opening, I don't think we can do anything but be much more hopeful about the way things are. Everything in Washington, I'm happy to report, is fine. The budget is almost balanced. The two parties are working cooperatively, and you guys are an exception. You're certainly an exception in what happened this year, as Judy said. I don't know whether California is now a leading indicator or a lagging indicator, but what happened here was certainly an exception. If you're a Republican, you're probably ready to write a book, What's the Matter with California? And if you're a Democrat, you're probably thinking, well, what's all the fuss about going on in the rest of the country? Things are pretty normal out here. We've been asked to talk about briefly what the meaning of this election was. And I mean, my shorthand on it is that 2010, in dramatic contrast to 2008, was a protest election. I mean, if you look back at 2008, and if you think back to kind of what the country felt like after the election of Barack Obama, we're in a totally different place at this point. 2008 was kind of an affirming election, a sense of hope that we might be able to turn the corner on some of the politics that had been so divisive and polarizing. The 2010 election was one in which the polarization was so evident, and the result of that was, as the president said, a shellacking for his party. The major factors in this, I think, are obvious to everybody. I mean, one is the economy. We are now at 19 months with the unemployment rate above 9%, with no prospect that it's going to go down below 9% anytime soon. I mean, just for some perspective on that, the recession that Ronald Reagan presided over in the early 1980s also had 19 months of unemployment above 9%, but no more than 19 months. And so we are in a period in which the economy feels worse and is worse. As I went around the country this fall, we all talked about, in shorthand terms, the anger that was out there and the disgust with Washington. And certainly that was the case. But there were also a whole series of emotions that if you talk to voters about what they were feeling, there was frustration, there was anger, there was dissatisfaction, there was anxiety, there was fear, there was a sense that government wasn't working, that their own futures were compromised at this point. And people are very worried, and as a result, they took it out on the party in power. There was another element to this also, and that is, I think, the debate that has been set off since the president took office about the size, scope, and reach of the federal government. This is a serious debate, but it is a debate that in the so far early stages of it has triggered a backlash against what the president has done. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why independents moved so decisively away from the Democratic Party this year and to the Republicans. Certainly the health care fight helped to further polarize the country, both because of the substance of what was in the bill, but also the process by which it got enacted. Everybody saw, in a sense, Congress at its worst. People who cover legislative bodies know that the sausage making is often pretty unattractive. But this was out there for everyone to see, and so I think for both of those reasons that the health care fight did it. And finally, I think that the other factor in this election was simply that the promise that Obama brought into office of being able, or probably being able to change Washington, to affect the tone in Washington, to move us into, if you will, a post-partisan era, whatever that may mean, did not happen. And I think there was a great letdown as a result of that, and probably a sense of frustration. Last point, how should the two sides interpret this? I think both sides are in danger of misreading what happened in this election. Republicans are in the situation, the classic situation of a winner over-interpreting what the election meant. This was not an election that was an affirming election of a whole set of Republican policies. It was clearly a call for a check on what President Obama and the Democrats have done, but not necessarily an endorsement of the entire agenda that the Republicans have. The danger for President Obama, on the other hand, I think, is to underinterpret this, to say, well, it really was just the economy, and the minute we begin to move out and the recovery begins to take hold in a more serious way, we're going to be back to normal. I think that's a mistake. I mean, I think his coalition for the time being has been shattered, and I think that in a fundamental way, the connection that Barack Obama made with the country in 2007 and 2008 has turned into a disconnect. And in one way or another, he is going to have to figure out how to get that back in order to get the country behind him to do the things he wants to do. So for that reason, I think that we are looking forward in Washington to a long period of confrontation. There will be some agreements, as there were today, on the tax plan and unemployment compensation. But I think we are in for a period in which both sides are going to be at each other's throats, trying to figure out who can gain the upper hand.
Dan, thank you very much for getting us started. Provocative thoughts. I'm going to turn next to Bill Whalen and ask you. You can talk about the national. You can talk about from a California perspective, but give us your take.
Okay, so a Republican gets a stage for 5 minutes. We won't be seeing much of this in Sacramento next year. First, thank you, Judy, and thank you, Mark, for the invitation to come up here. I am a recovering Sacramentan, 11 years and counting, so it's a pleasure to see a lot of old faces in the crowd. Not that I go back a long way, but Greg Lucas was writing for the Chronicle when I was last year. Dan Walters was writing for the Bee as he is now. But it's great to see a lot of you. Let me give you a couple of buzzwords out of this election to chew on, things which I think encapsulate what happened out here in 2010. One buzzword is government. If you look at the ballot and look on the initiative side, those initiatives which could somehow be tied into either the concept of government or money or revenue pretty much went down to defeat. You're going to say, wait a minute, what about Proposition 25, which makes it easier to pass a budget? Government idea. Well, that campaign was run very cleverly against Sacramento and against government. So it's an odd disconnect for Republicans. In 2002, the year before Arnold Schwarzenegger comes to office, we lose every statewide constitutional office. In 2010, in Arnold's last year in office, we lose every statewide constitutional office. But you look at the initiatives, and if you're Republican, with the exception of Prop 23, you're pretty happy with the ballot. Well, Prop 25 also, but you do pretty well from a Republican standpoint on the ideas. It's the candidates, which leads to the second buzzword, which is Republican itself. Republican ideas did not do that poorly in California on Election Day. We voted against marijuana legalization. We voted to increase the threshold on fees. Republican ideas in general. The problem is if you have the word Republican before your name as a candidate, in which case you're in big trouble. So we have a branding problem as California Republicans. And I point out, by the way, that's probably a good thing that I'm not sitting at the other end there, because if I moved a little further to the right, I'd be off the stage, which is kind of a net metaphor for the California Republican Party these days. The third buzzword I'll leave you with is experimentation. We didn't want to experiment with legalizing pot. Carly Fiorina runs for the Senate as an experimental concept, a former CEO being a senator, rejected soundly. Meg Whitman runs as a CEO, former CEO for governor, rejected soundly. So we were not in a mood to experiment. To me, the overarching concept in this election is the phrase electile dysfunction. Freudian slip. God, I practiced that all day and I knew it blew it when I had the chance. Let's try it again cleanly. Electile dysfunction. It's a problem that concerns California politics, and unfortunately it's a problem that a little blue pill cannot solve. And what is electile dysfunction? Got it right. Electile dysfunction is simply this. In 2002, we had a regularly scheduled election. 11 months later, we booted Gray Davis. 2004, a regularly scheduled election. 2005, a special election. You can see where we're going. 2006, regularly scheduled election. 2007, hey, why not? Special election. Nothing in 2007. 2008, regularly scheduled election. 2009, what the hey? Special election. 2010 election. We've had one time out since 2002. 1 year off where we mercifully were spared from politics. And this is the dysfunction, I think. I think voters in California are simply becoming tired of the never-ending campaign process. A good friend of mine who's a political reporter who comes to California to cover things out here had a really interesting conversation. He went to a fundraiser. It was, I think, a Fiorina fundraiser. And he said, you know what I noticed pulling in? The best cars belong to political consultants. It's been a good business in California to be a political consultant. It's actually been a pretty good time to run a local TV station with all the ads. But the problem is this, the public is slowly suffering from this. Look at page 17, page 18 of Mark Baldessari's latest report on California politics, and the question, how much confidence, how much faith do you have in your elected leaders in California? The result, how much faith? Do you have high faith in elected leaders in California? 3%. 3. You can't get much lower than that. That is dysfunctional. This is one of the challenges that Jerry Brown faces as governor. It's how to restore that faith process. I don't think life is that horrible for California Republicans. You can still play the initiative game if you want to, but I think you have to set your sights lower. You have to look down the ballot and down the ticket instead of up. You have to start building a farm team, to use a baseball analogy, start electing people into lower levels, city councils, mayors, and build up from that. I worked for Pete Wilson. He cut his teeth as an assemblyman and then a mayor of San Diego before he hit the big leagues in the Senate and governor. We have to practice ideas as well, but California is what it is. A final thought, and excuse me for filibustering if I am, it is hard to see California right now as terribly relevant in the national picture, simply for this reason. We will not factor in the 2012 election, aside from maybe the Republican primary. Barack Obama will run a skeleton campaign out here, just as we had in 2004 and 2008. It won't be a contest. He'll win by 14 or 15 points. People will follow us for initiatives maybe, but in terms of a lot of our problems, the rest of the country is going to tune out. You're going to see the focus, I think, in traditional battleground states. Dan Balz might make a swing through here, but he's going to spend his time in Ohio and Florida and the upper Midwest. I'm sorry, Dan, but that's the way it is. With one caveat, and that's unless our governor decides to get involved with this. And if a year from now, if Judy Woodruff is doing an interview with Jerry Brown from somewhere in Iowa, then I will begin the recall movement myself. Thank you.
Well, let me know if you think that's going to...
You never know.
All right. Great. Thank you very much, Bill. Gale Kaufman.
Thank you all for inviting me. I would like to put a few disparate thoughts on the table to discuss what I think just happened. If you look back, and yes, we've had nothing but a lot of special elections and elections, period, and it is very good for the consulting business, I'll give you that. But I think Dan's comments were really interesting to me if you try and contrast them to what went on out here. I think in California for the last 2 years, there was an incredible sense of frustration by voters, but it wasn't completely or really about Obama and what was going on in Washington. It was the fact that Mac Taylor's comments were more relevant to voters, and voters were very, very clear that the budget situation, the dysfunction of passing a budget or not passing a budget on time was uppermost in people's minds at the same time that the economy was having such an incredibly horrible effect on California as well as the rest of the country. So what was on the minds of voters? They were really looking to see what and who, so you're talking about issues as well as candidates, who could possibly help the situation out here and make it better. And I think they came into this election cycle. It wasn't very long ago, if you were a Democrat and you were trying to look at turnout models for the November election, that you were assuming a terrible turnout for Democrats. They were disengaged, there was no primary, there were lots of reasons. You read all the same stories, I'm sure, that I did. There was no real reason. Certainly the down ticket didn't excite people. So why would Democrats come out and vote? And if you're me and you do this for a living, and I'm sure Mark would agree, you changed your model of who was going to turn out as the months progressed. But you certainly didn't think that the turnout that ultimately came out, and I'm sure we'll be talking a little bit later about the Latino vote in particular, was going to turn out to be what it was. And so that's, I think, an important thing that happened and in California that surprised us, that took us by surprise at the end. And I think some of that had to do, a lot of that had to do with the governor's race, which we haven't really mentioned. And we probably should. You might have seen a commercial or two, I'm not sure. But I saw some. So they obviously were carried in Sacramento. The fact that Meg Whitman started out so early and so hard and was on TV for so long and spent whatever she ended up spending, but upwards of at least $150 million shouldn't be lost. I think that just added in some respects to a different frustration by voters in terms of the electoral process and in terms of just the whole campaign setup. And it was a very schizophrenic election, as well as, if you were following it, it was schizophrenic to watch what was going on. You had Meg Whitman with millions of tracts of ads saying lots of different things, but never really, in my opinion, telling anyone who she was in particular, except mostly in the negative. You may remember right at the end she came out with an ad where she actually spoke to camera, and it was thought to be one of her better ads. But for someone who was on the air for as long as she was, it was a kind of disconnected campaign. And if you were Jerry Brown, you ran as small a campaign as was humanly possible, certainly not the campaign that Democrats are used to seeing. It wasn't a mobilizing campaign. In fact, the only ground effort that was done that we're all known for being very good at was done by an independent expenditure, not by his campaign, but by unions who decided if there was going to be any effort at all, it was going to have to be done by them. So those were some oddities of this election cycle for California, and I think shouldn't be ignored in this discussion. Yes, voters are tired of elections. I would agree mostly with the analysis of where voters were on all the initiatives. Having run the 25 campaign, it wasn't all about negatives. We actually did talk about what 25 did. And I think, to my surprise, a lot of people, when you asked them, actually knew what that issue was. And I think your polling shows that as opposed to perhaps Prop 24 and other issues that were on the ballot, voters connected with that issue. And I think it's because everything is about the budget. Anything that would make it easier and would make the legislature and the governor do their job and get a budget done was something they would entertain. And I think that had a lot more to do with 25 passing than anything else. And so I'll stay there. I have some other thoughts, but I don't want to go on too long. I think this was a perplexing election in a lot of ways in terms of if you were trying to forecast for the future. Because voters, if you go through all the initiatives, I don't think they really were looking at each one individually. And I think, yes, there are some lessons, but I also think they did what they always do. They went all the way down the ballot and they read whatever they needed to make an informed decision. They certainly didn't want to spend any more money. They did want to deliver some messages to the legislature and this governor. But more than anything else, they tried to do a good job of getting through the ballot.
Gale Kaufman. Fernando Guerra, you get the floor for the last statement, and then we'll go to questions. Your turn.
Thank you. As a professor, I'm not used to limiting myself to 5 minutes, and I'm certainly not used to sharing the podium. So I'll try to speak in bullet points. Let me take a look at the Latino vote and take a look at what I consider the 5 major results that happened in the election. Number 1, the Republican sweep nationally. Number 2, the Western firewall, meaning Nevada, Washington, Colorado. Number 3, California blue that we've been talking about. Number 4, the voter impatience. I think Mark referred to it as the change election. I think it was also referred to as a protest vote. And then finally, number 5, the Latino Republicans and their tremendous gains that they made as elected officials. There are now 2 Latino governors, 1 Latino U.S. senator, and I think about 4 Latino U.S. members of Congress, unprecedented from that perspective. What did the Latino vote have to do with the Republican tidal wave that occurred? Basically nothing other than in Florida. I mean, Latinos obviously voted mostly Democratic throughout, with the exception of Florida. You're going to constantly hear me talk about the exception of Florida, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. The Western Firewall, Latinos had everything to do with that. Without the Latino vote, Harry Reid and Senator Murray and Senator Bennett would not have won. Had no Latino voted in that election for either party, they would have lost. Or had Latinos split their vote 50-50, they would have lost. Latinos provided the margin of victory for those 3 U.S. senators and kept the Senate in the Democratic hands. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other groups when you have such a close election that can also say the same thing. California Blue, certainly we're going to talk about this quite a bit, the Latino vote and how it's changed California. And I do believe California remains very relevant in the national elections. I mean, the fact that it's so blue, so Democratic, and that the Democratic Party does not have to spend any money or any time to win 20% of what the electoral vote required to be president is significant. And if Republicans spend $140 million and can't make a dent, you know it's off the chart, off the game board, and that they're going to have to spend money elsewhere. This allows for it really structures the rest of the national election, what California has been doing. Voter impatience, I mean, you clearly see it going back and forth, the ping pong effect. But one thing about Latino voters, they've been extremely consistent, not only here in California, but everywhere else, which leads me to the next point about the tremendous Latino gains in the Republican Party. And it had nothing to do with the Latino vote. All those Latino elected officials, all those Latino Republicans who won, none of them won with a Latino majority. None of them received a Latino majority vote. Two of my favorite Latino Republicans are here, Ruben Morales and Gary Vasquez. Actually, two of my favorite Republicans are here. Even you guys weren't able to get the majority of the Latino vote when you ran. It's just it's a very difficult thing to do. And so it was very clearly that Latinos continue to support Democratic and are part of this liberal Democratic coalition that exists in California. And when Latinos are not part of that, the Democratic candidate or the liberal initiative will lose. Why Proposition 19 lost was because Latinos didn't vote for it. Why Proposition 8 lost back in 2008 was because Latinos didn't vote for it. They tend to structure a lot of what is happening. They're the ones that can make or break a candidate, a political party, or initiative. Now, there are a couple of things that still give a little bit of hope to Republicans consistently about the Latino vote. One is pre-election polling. Just about every pre-election poll, about 6 months out before an election, always shows that maybe the Latino vote is in play. Consistently, it shows that. And Republicans get all excited about it. And it really is a carrot. And what happens there is, I think Latino voters, and I've gotten this from a lot of the focus groups that we've done, is they actually believe a political campaign and a candidate when they first speak. And so when you tell them that you're going to do certain things or that this initiative does certain things, they actually believe it and support it. In 1994, a majority of Latino voters in the first pre-election poll supported Proposition 187, okay? Because the way it was presented to them, they said, oh, that's a good thing. It was pretty, Mig Whitman was getting quite a bit of support. And what was interesting was amongst Latinos, she was actually getting 40 to 45% of Latino foreign-born voters, those that have been born abroad, become citizens, registered to vote. About 45% of them were supportive of her in the initial elections. And the reason why was they were watching all the Univision, or Telemundo commercials that were being aired that were very positive and very good, and they're saying, hey, this lady sounds great. So pre-election polling will always get Republicans excited about Latinos. Don't worry about it. It isn't going to happen. The second also has to do with polling. A lot of the PPIC polling and other. And Republicans always love to say, man, take a look at the poll results. Latinos are conservatives. They're just like us. You know, they are all socially conservative on a lot of these issues. And it's true, the polling time after time shows that Latinos are much more conservative than their Democratic coalition partners on a lot of different issues. But again, if you take a look at focus group results, you'll see that when they don't like to talk about those issues as being public issues. In other words, Latinos don't believe that the discussion about homosexuality or abortion or gay marriage or any of those issues should be discussed in the public realm. Religion and those type of things should only be discussed in the home. And if you as a public official come to talk to me about that, I don't want to talk to you about that. What they do believe should be discussed in the public realm is what Democrats talk about. And so Latinos do not publicly go out and vote on those issues. They vote on the issues that Democrats.
I'm going to interrupt you and exercise my prerogative as moderator because you're raising a lot of interesting points here that we want to get to. I was going to start with a more broad-based question, but because you've said some of the things you have about the Latino vote, I want to turn right away to Bill Whalen. Do you accept this notion that it's just a pipe dream for Republicans to think that they can ever...
The problem is once the campaign begins and the fur starts flying, Republicans take a hit. And look what happened to Whitman in this campaign. I don't know where she was before the story broke about her housekeeper, but once the housekeeper story broke, she collapsed like a house of cards. And I think what happened in Whitman's case, and this is cautionary, Gale alluded to this in her presentation, I hate to play armchair quarterback in hindsight with candidates because you don't know what goes inside a room. Sometimes candidates get bad advice. Sometimes candidates are bad at taking good advice. You don't know precisely why a campaign ends up train wrecking. But I know this much with her campaign. In the beginning, she did not really create a biographical sketch of herself outside of the fact that she was a very successful CEO. She was endeavoring to do something very historic. She was endeavoring to be the first woman governor of California. Now, maybe they looked at her and they saw that in her entire life there wasn't something necessarily pathos in it to talk about. We're so used to candidates now. It's Barack Obama with multiculturalism, George Bush overcoming alcoholism, Bill Clinton never knowing his father. We sort of look for that People magazine angle to a candidate. And I think one thing which seriously hurt Meg Whitman is there was never really a People magazine angle to her. Remember when she first ran and they did the picture with the horse and they had to get off that really quick. But getting back to the point, I don't think they ever necessarily created her as a terribly likable person, Judy. And thus when this scandal broke about Nikki, and SEIU jumped immediately and piled on her with $5 million of attack ad saying that she is a mean, wealthy woman who does not like Hispanics. There was no reservoir of goodwill for her, in short. But I would also point out that within the Republican circles, how many Republicans came to her defense within the Latino community?
Dan, broadly, you've clearly looked at the Latino vote across the country. Is there hope for the Republicans among Latinos?
Well, there is in some places. I mean, obviously Florida, but the Latino vote in Florida is totally unlike what it is in almost any other state because it's so heavily Cuban American, and that is a much more conservative vote. I mean, if you look out here at the difference between what Fiorina did with the Latino vote and what Meg Whitman did, they're basically identical. I mean, despite her, the domestic problem that broke at the end, the Latino vote in this state, I think, is a much stronger Democratic vote than it is in almost any other state with a sizable Latino population. What I've seen, I was based in our Texas bureau back in the early 80s during the first Bush administration. The first Reagan administration. And at that time, Republicans were talking about the Latino vote can be much more our vote than it is now for the reasons that Fernando talked about. It's a much more conservative population. They agree with Republicans on a lot of issues. And what I have seen over now 30 years is that there are occasional Republican candidates who figure out a way to tap into that. George W. Bush obviously was one. He did quite well. But that is the exception and not the rule, and the party has never been able to build on it in any significant way. And I don't see anything in the near future that's likely to change that.
All right, I want to come back to the topic that's been on the table and that Mac Taylor put out there for those of you who are in California, but it resonates across the country, and it has to do with, do the voters want their elected officials to work together to solve these problems? And I ask this question because I saw polls, and I know all of you did, that said there is a significant minority that wants their elected official to go and defend principle. They don't want them to work with the other side. So I'd like to hear all of you talk about that, because to solve some of these very tough problems, the budget, deficit, energy, the issues that we know that are out there right now and that are coming down the line, the two parties are going to have to work together here in California and in Washington. And my question is it your sense that that's what the voters want, Gale?
I'm not sure. I think you said two things here, and I think both of them are... Whoops. I'm gone. I think both of them are true. I think there is a strong minority, large minority of voters who, especially on the Democratic side, who say, given where we are with the budget and given so much at stake, in particular education funding, healthcare funding, that they want the Democrats to hold out and hold up the budget for the things that they believe in and feel so strongly about. But they hate the fighting as well. The disconnect is they can't figure out the one thing they send everybody up here to do is pass the budget. And the more months that go on, the longer the process drags on. They just don't know why they can't do that one thing that they send them up here to do. So I'm not sure I answered exactly your question, right, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they want them to figure it out, whatever that takes. And I guess that would be bipartisanship. Yeah.
How do you read, Fernando, what the voters want from their elected officials, and to what extent does it bear on what these elected officials do? Well,
certainly they want them to work together, but the typical voter or resident doesn't understand the checks and balances that exist in government. I think what is really interesting about this election is the fact that now in California you're going to have one-party rule in a sense. All constitutional offices for the Democrats, both houses of the legislature, and now they can pass a budget without two-thirds. Now it is very easy for people to take a look. Democrats are in control. They're very much in control, and contrary to previous years. And you have that contrast between Democrats in California and what they're going to be proposing and how they're going to be handling the budget to Republicans at the national level. And so this is a much clearer picture for people to understand. People believe and think that, okay, Barack Obama won, he's completely in control, he can do everything. And they get frustrated when he can't, not understanding a lot of the play that exists.
I think they simply want government to work better, which is at the heart of the Prop 25 argument that why can't these people pass a budget on time? But here's the problem. It's the inherent nature of the California voter, which is gas and brake at all times. You want to see an interesting study, ask a California voter how they would fix the budget. Well, okay, I'm in favor of budget cuts. Well, 60% of the budget's education. You want to cut education? No. Well, 20% of the budget's healthcare. Do you want to touch that? No. Where do you want to go with the rest? You want to cut prisons? No, no, no. In short, voters are like that commercial for the Guy's Diet where they show the former jocks, all of whom have lost 30 pounds, and the ad is what? Eat whatever you want and still lose weight. And that's the California voter in a nutshell. They want to have it all but not sacrifice at the same time. And there's an interesting, I think, situation coming to a head here perhaps within a year from now, and that's in a rare moment of truth in the campaign. Jerry Brown said, I'm not going to raise taxes, but I'm open to the concept of the legislature and I putting something on the ballot and letting the good people of California decide. I think that will be a great maturity test of California, the legislature and the governor, of voters ultimately to decide, is this the way we want to go?
So you're saying put something on the ballot again?
What Jerry Brown said in the campaign was, look, we have a horrible budget deficit and spending cuts alone will not fix it. We're going to have to raise taxes perhaps, but I'm not going to do it on my own. We're going to let the public decide if they want to go that route.
But the argument you made a few minutes ago is that voters are weary of...
Well, herein lies the problem. Voters are weary, number one, but secondly, there's a maturity test. And frankly, there's a maturity test in my Republican Party. If you want to raise taxes in California and do it by the ballot, you're going to have to call a special election. So believe me, there's some knucklehead like me sitting in some corner of California figuring out what can I put on the ballot to really junk up the situation and kill this thing. And what they'll probably do is put something on there like a part-time legislature proposal or something like that, dare the legislature to go have the tax increase. Again, Judy, it just tests our maturity as a public to solve our problems.
Dan, what about this question of that did emerge in the polling we saw this year, that there is a significant minority of people out there who don't want to see the two sides work together?
Well, I mean, I think we are in a period of historic polarization and political volatility. I mean, you almost have to go back to the late 19th century when Congress changed hands with some frequency to get something similar to what we are going through now. There's some very interesting work that's been done in political science that basically says we tend to think that it's the elites who are polarized, that it's the party activists who are polarized and that the rest of the country is not. There's now evidence that the rest of the country is almost as polarized as the elite. So what's the way out? There's certainly no easy or short way out of this. I mean, but when you talk to people, when you do focus groups, you do hear this frustration of why can't they work together. You know, it will require leadership. It will require leadership on the part of, nationally, President Obama and the congressional Republicans to see what they are prepared to do, what risks they're prepared to take to try to do some cooperative work. We've just had the Simpson-Bowles Deficit Commission finish its work in Washington, and they fell short of their goal, which was to get 14 of the 18 members to vote for the package. And so in a pure sense, they failed in their mission. But they got 11 votes, and of the 12 elected officials on the 18-member panel, they got half of them to vote for it, and they got 5 of the 6 senators on the panel to vote for it. Now, many of those people who voted for it on the panel will not necessarily vote for it on the floor. But there is some momentum now behind the idea of, as there may be out here, I don't know, on budgetary matters, to try to do something significant on a very big issue. But it will take the leadership of the two sides to get that thing moving forward.
I think the line, I guess, from Erskine Bowles was that the era of deficit denial is behind us.
Right,
You
right.
can't deny anymore that it's
Yeah.
there. All right, I'm going to turn to all of you, but before I do, I want to ask each one of you to give us an example of an issue or a problem on which you think the two parties can come together and come up with a solution in the coming year that it will move us forward, whether it's budget, whether it's health care, whatever it is.
Well, number one for me, I think, in the Latino community is the DREAM Act. It's not complete immigration reform. It's not comprehensive immigration reform, but it's really about kids who've been here since they were 2 or 3. And, you know, in terms of a lot of polling and a lot of focus groups that I see, even Republicans are for this. When you talk to them, explain it to them. Now, when it gets leveraged in political campaigns, it loses some. But I think that is really symbolic from the Latino community, saying, if you can't pass us and be inclusive into this society, if you can't bring us in, that is really communicating to us that you are just not going to do anything to bring the Latino community in. And so I think the DREAM Act is one that has the possibility as not doing complete immigration reform, but symbolically doing this.
But not in the lame duck session right now. It's not.
No, I don't think it. No, not in this.
Prospects
No.
look very, very tough. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think what we saw today, some progress on a compromise on the extending the Bush tax cuts and funding unemployment compensation. I think it's going to be difficult. I think that there will be some cooperation at a minimum simply to keep the government going and funded at a somewhat lower level. I think there will be some spending cuts that both sides will end up agreeing to. Perhaps the DREAM Act next year, but I have to say I'm reasonably pessimistic about what the future is going to hold. Bill Galston, who's a very wise Brookings scholar, said he thinks that we are in for 2 phases. That the first year will be confrontation between the White House and the Republicans in Congress, but that at some point, one side or the other will look at public opinion and conclude that they are losing the battle of public opinion over that gridlock, and that at that point there will begin to be movement on one side or the other, and therefore some cooperation. I think that is probably the most optimistic view of what we're looking for over the next 2 years. The pessimistic view is that this is a 2-year campaign that we are just starting and that the battle is being fought out for what happens in 2012.
What do you see the prospect?
Well, I think in California, at least, it's all about the budget. So I think the two issues that might have some capacity, and I'm very pessimistic as well, especially because now with Prop 25 and an entire Democratic leadership, it appears that Democrats, in fact, are in charge. So that's great, except we have a huge deficit, and the only way to get around that deficit and increase revenue would be if the two sides work together. So that's where the pessimism comes in, because it's really hard to do that. The two issues, it seems to me, would be, and this won't come as a surprise to anyone, but I'd like to think that on education funding, we've hit the bottom of where we can go. So hopefully some togetherness on that issue, and there's a lot of discussion about that over education funding, might be possible. And I also think some budget reform, a 2-year budget, and some of the other issues that we've been talking about for a long time is about the only thing I can think of where there might be a possibility of getting some togetherness.
You agree, Bill?
Yeah, I do. I think here in
On those
California,
two?
I think in California you can see some agreement on education. And Governor-elect Brown ran on this sort of vague concept of decentralizing government, sending authority back to local government. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but perhaps they can reach some common ground on that. Nationally, though, I don't think there's going to be much common ground at all. We talk about Bill Clinton triangulating after 1994 and doing welfare reform. He ran on welfare reform in 1992. And basically, he was going back to being a Southern governor between 1994 and 1996. It's not in Barack Obama's gene pool, I think, to do this, number one. But secondly, if I'm in the White House in their political office, I'm making two calculations. Number one, the Republicans in Congress ultimately will overplay their hand. Jim DeMint, the sort of wild-eyed guys beneath John Boehner who really want to blow up Washington, they're going to just not be able to control themselves. But then secondly, I look at the cast of people running in 2012 right now, and nobody scares me if I'm Barack Obama. As weak politically as he might be right now, you look at the 2012 people, and it's not a very scary lot.
On that note, we want questions from all of you, so raise your hand, and I'm going to try, there are bright lights here, but I'm going to try to find you and call on you. This is your chance.
Lulled everyone to sleep.
Is there a hand over here? Yes. Stand up and don't be bashful. Maybe give us your name and...
Sure. Hi, I'm Kim Alexander with the California Voter Foundation. I'm interested to hear what you all said about the election process, and I wonder, I know that voting is difficult for voters in California because of the confusion of the propositions, and I hope you all have seen the PPIC survey that came out just last week that highlighted how bad that situation's become. But from my vantage point, what I hear a lot from voters is how confused they are about the process itself, finding their polling place, determining their registration status. There are a lot of things about voting in California that we have not modernized. We don't have a lot of online tools that a lot of other states have. And in my experience, I've come to believe that California elections are more dysfunctional and poorly run than elections in other states. But I haven't been on the ground in other states, and I wonder if Mr. Balz or Judy Woodruff or maybe if the consultants have any ideas about how California, the mechanics of elections in California, how they operate compared to other states, and whether that's something that we need to address.
I'm not sure I feel qualified to speak with any authority on that. I'd really like to hear from one of you, or Dan.
Well, I'm no authority on that state by state either. I mean, although I have always regarded California as a difficult state to be a voter in because of the ballot initiatives and sometimes the length of the ballot, but also the complexity of the issues that are put before you. And I'm sure it is frustrating. I mean, the thing that I think is good that I see around the country is making it easier to register to vote, and also making it easier to vote by having very easy either absentee rules or early voting rules, and or vote by mail, as Oregon now does, and other states doing a lot more of it, including Colorado. I think all of those are helpful, but if you've got a ballot that's 600 pages long, no matter whether you're mailing it in or walking to the polling place, it's pretty difficult.
Any of you want to comment on the difficulties in voting here? Gale?
I would disagree a little, Kim. I mean, I think it isn't, with so many absentee voters, and there's a tremendous number of permanent absentee voters in California now. I think we have made it easier for people to get information, and we certainly, with online information, the ballot handbook, where everyone and every initiative has sites and more places for people to get things. I think there's a tremendous amount of information. I think, so I'm not sure that voters feel burdened, except, as Dan said, with the number of initiatives and the length of the ballot itself.
Okay, I'm looking for another hand out there. You're going to have to help me because of the lights.
No question.
Yes, right here. I'm going to ask you to stand up and...
I'll make it simple. It's Sam Rodriguez with Comcast. So on a national scale, since for now they want to talk a little bit about Florida. Recently, Senator-elect Marco Rubio and Newt Gingrich were kind of testing code words, and they were calling public employees special class. Given that in California, about 11% of the workforce are part of a union household, and it's part of the Democratic coalition, so Gale could probably talk about this. Do you see any trends that type of rhetoric will sink into California, given that now that we have a Democratic majority, Democratic governor, and as Bill mentioned, a disabled Republican Party?
I mean, clearly pension reform is one of the major issues, and public employees is one of the major issues facing the budget. And you have Democrats like Governor Brown, Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, who we're going to hear from tomorrow, all talking about pension reform and how they're going to take care or deal with that. So it's on the table. The old adage that I know everybody hates using, that if it took Nixon to go to China, it's going to take someone like an Antonio Villaraigosa, former UTLA organizer, to deal with this issue in Los Angeles, and a Jerry Brown. I think you just take a look at the numbers and the way those numbers go. You have to deal with it. How they go about doing it and the politics around that is going to be, and you can't blame the Republicans about holding that up now, given their position. So it's definitely on the table.
I agree.
I would just add, not just here. I mean, every governor that I've talked to through the fall and post-election has raised the issue of public employee compensation, pensions, health care. Salaries, but salaries less. I mean, it's as one said, the legacy costs that they're dealing with. Everyone is going to take it on, and I think that we're going to see a lot of different models of how to do it. I mean, there's some who are going to be very confrontational. Chris Christie in New Jersey, who is just by DNA a confrontational kind of guy, is at war on this issue and will take on the unions. John Kasich, who got beat up pretty badly by the unions in his campaign for governor of Ohio, is sort of loaded for bear on this. Rick Snyder in Michigan, former Gateway executive, said to me he thinks this is the next big national issue after health care, but that it's going to be played out in the states. He's, I think, got a sort of a more moderate approach in how to deal with it, but everybody is going to take this on, and I think that the public employee unions are probably much more on the defensive today than they've ever been.
And that says they think that they can win those fights. If
They do, yeah.
I mentioned earlier I was surprised that the Whitman campaign didn't really create more of a biographical sketch of her. I'm also surprised that at the end of the campaign they didn't really have her run on one specific issue. And to me, the one that was always sitting there was pension reform and Bell, California, and Meg simply saying that I'm going to California, I'm going to go to Sacramento and fix the pension problem. I plan to work with the legislature, but if they won't work with me, I'll go straight to the people. And I think a very interesting what if she had been elected governor, would have been her relationship or lack thereof with the folks who ganged up on Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2005, and if they would still have the same standing. Remember, Arnold in that special election, took a big hit, and he took it from the combined forces of the teachers, the nurses, and the firefighters and public employees, people who wear the white hat in society. Well, that was 5 years ago, and I'm not sure if the same standing is there with voters that it was 5 years ago. So to me, it's a great what if with her campaign.
Okay. Yes, right here.
Let's go back to the Reagan years just for a moment. And
would you mind telling us your name?
Norm King, sort of unattached at this point in my life. Not with my wife, however. Let me make that clear. No, I'm not.
Like on Facebook, right?
Status.
This is not starting out right. Back to President Reagan. For good or bad, his administration's clearly lowered marginal tax rates. In my opinion, for very good, it also cleansed the tax system of what we call tax expenditures. So much of the focus of all our discussion about tax policy ignores tax expenditures. And it's curious to me, and this probably applies more to the national federal government than the state, that we have a Republican Party that says it doesn't want government dictating what personal choices are, but very much supporting all kinds of loopholes for various reasons, whether it's the housing deduction or ethanol or agricultural subsidies. Look at the Midwest Republicans doing that. And Democrats who curiously support all kinds of tax expenditures under the guise that they help the common person, but in fact, most tax expenditures, and I believe this is a fact, clearly benefit the most affluent. Why can't we get together on what would seem to be some values that would merge and deal with a very large amount of money that could help begin to cure the national deficit if we stop focusing just on direct expenditures of the federal government and deal with all these stupid good ideas that certain legislators think it's good to discount the amount of money the U.S. Treasury will get so that we can spur that kind of good idea on somebody's part.
Well, tax expenditures were very much a part of the Bowles-Simpson Commission.
Right. And that's part of my point.
Right. So where do we think it goes? I mean, do we think it has legs, I guess is the question. Is that something that's going to catch on? We've sort of addressed that tangentially.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of it for this reason. I think that the Republican Party today is a party that is against tax increases, no matter how you talk about it. As Judy said, the Simpson-Bowles plan does a lot of the kinds of things you are suggesting, which is to pare away the tax expenditures, lower all rates, and come up with a much simpler and more equitable tax system. But that will include some tax increases for some people. And I had a conversation with Governor Pawlenty, who's likely to be a presidential candidate in 2012. We talked about this a few weeks ago, and he basically said, if the commission thinks the Republican Party is of a frame of mind today to raise taxes in any way, shape, or form, they're dealing with the wrong group. Now, maybe as a result of some of the momentum that appears that may exist, that will begin to change a bit. But I think right now it is very difficult for any Republican to come out and say, yes, we're prepared to really put all of that on the table.
And then you take a look at the third parties. The only, I think the Libertarian candidate for lieutenant governor got like 6% of the vote. And the only reason he did that is because there was a Latino running in the Republican ticket. And Abel Maldonado got 40% of the Latino vote. Had Meg Whitman or Free Arena received that same percent, they would have been elected. So why wasn't Maldonado elected? White Republicans refused to vote for him. They actually, if you take a look, they went over and they voted for the Libertarian Party. They weren't willing to vote for a Latino candidate. Now, some may say it was his tax position or something else or another, but there they had the chance to vote for a Latino candidate statewide, and again showed the Latino community that even their own, they're not willing to support a Republican candidate. Again, evidence that there's a disconnect between the Republican Party and the Latino community.
I'd like to see a show of hands from people who think that Arnold Schwarzenegger could have won the recall as an independent. Not as a Republican if he ran as an independent in 2003. Nobody thinks he could have won as an independent in the recall? Hands are starting to come up. What if he had abandoned the Republican Party in 2005 and run as an independent in 2006? Could he have run as an independent and won? One hand, two hands, three hands. So is reluctance. If I were king for a day in California, I'd eliminate the phrase decline to state. It's government using three words to use one, independent. That's just a bugaboo of mine. But we're on a glide path here, make no mistake. While the Democrats hover around, 42, 44%, Gale, something like that, my little GOP is at about 31%,
right,
and fading fast. At some point, the DTSs are going to catch the Republicans and bypass them, which begs this question: will somebody emerge in this state in the next 10 to 20 years, like Arnold or a Mike Bloomberg or somebody like that, who is phenomenally wealthy? Like Arnold probably has to have built-in 80 or 90% name recognition, but runs as sort of the the ultimate anti-machine candidate, and runs as an independent. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility if the state continues on this path.
I don't agree, because I think what Gale was talking about, the independents are not monolithic in terms of ideology or how they perceive themselves. So there is not one candidate that they would, if you all of a sudden said, I am the decline to state party person,
right.
Those people wouldn't vote for you.
But
it's not that. Most of them are still Democratic leaning or Republican leaning, who are just for one reason or another upset with the party and have registered in that manner. Look at the pattern is so similar to the Democrat and Republicans, almost identical in terms of the registration, election after election. So I don't think that will happen. Also want to remind people that Schwarzenegger won the recall with a plurality, not a majority. And if you take a look at if I were king for a day or rey por el día, and was going to create the scenario for a Republican to win the governorship, I would create 2003, a recall election, a celebrity like that, okay? And that would be perfect. My second scenario would be just what happened. A moderate woman who's willing to spend $140 million. It's going to be a Republican wave throughout the whole country. We're going to have the most diverse Republican set of candidates statewide. 3 women, a Latino, a black. I don't even know if anybody was disabled or not. I think some of them were. And you take a look at that. That would be the Republican dream. Mm-hmm. And they don't even come close. I mean, how difficult is it to be a Republican and running statewide? I don't even.
Well,
I think they.
But if
you're lucky to be on the panel.
Am I a quota? Is that what you're saying? I'm a quota. But no, but with Meg, yes, we can draw up that. Yeah, she spent all this money, she's centrist and all that, but she had some very basic flaws. She didn't bother to vote. She didn't necessarily identify what her campaign was.
Whoopsie.
You could not put your chin more out there for Jerry Brown than that.
All right, we're not going to relitigate the whole election, although there's going to be a caucus afterwards. We have time for one more question, and if we don't, do we have one? I'm looking around. If not, I just want to take a quick poll of the room and ask how many of you, having heard what Mac Taylor said earlier, having heard what these panelists have said, how many of you think that there will be some sort of an agreement that Governor Brown and the legislature and the Republicans will be able to come to on budget, the most important budget issues going forward this year, next year? Oh, now that's, see?
You put the word Republican in there.
Exactly.
That's a problem.
Maybe
Wow.
a third of the room?
Ask the question differently.
A lot of alcohol in the room.
Yeah.
And with that, back to Mark.
Judy, thank you so much for being here, and all of the panelists. Very, very informative discussion, very, very fun, and really we gained a lot out of the back and forth that occurred. And I'm glad that you're all on this stage tonight. Thank you. A couple of I wanted to just make a couple of comments about things that I heard tonight, and I was really struck by the fact that both at the national and at the state level, what an important role now the economy and the budget and taxes and spending and borrowing and deficits, and how much that's on voters' minds and how much that is really, driving the political discussion both in California and in Washington now. And it also strikes me that if you're an elected official coming out of this election, whether it's in California, where the Democrats did very well, or in Washington, where the Republicans did very well, I don't think that you can have much comfort in the results of this recent election. It seems to me that the voters are in a are in a very volatile place in terms of where they go from here, and a wait and see mode in terms of what type of leadership they might want next. If I look at the results in California, I think that one of the things that I found very encouraging about this election, I haven't seen enough about the national election results yet, was that this was an election in which we heard that there wasn't much voter enthusiasm. We were expecting a low turnout. There wasn't sure, whether the Democrats were going to be enthused in terms of, not really having much in the way of a primary. The Republicans, whether they'd be enthused coming out to vote, and whether independents and Latinos would vote. And if there was a surprise on the upside, for me, it was the fact that our voter turnout ended up being 59.5%, or 10,280,000, according to the latest statistics from the California Secretary of State. So the voters seem to be quite engaged in terms of what's going on now and really wanting to weigh in, and whether that's a function of the flow of information and the speed of information that's occurring, or just the times that we're in, and also, really in the mood for trying to figure out if there's something that might work, something that I've described as a reform-minded nature, and I'm seeing this certainly in California, but also at the national level. Exactly where that will go next is hard to say, but certainly I don't think that any of our elected officials in office, in Washington or Sacramento, can take much comfort in the fact that their places are secure going forward, and I think voters have very high expectations. So there's just some thoughts that I had in terms of what I heard from what I thought was just a fascinating conversation tonight, and I'm glad that you could all be here and be a part of that. We will continue this conference tomorrow morning. I would suggest coming down here at 8 o'clock, because this is a small group compared to what we're expecting tomorrow. And we're also expecting to begin our program at around 8:15 with Mayor Villaraigosa, and then we will move to our education panel, and then climate change, and at lunchtime we have two speakers on the economy, Laura Tyson and Michael Boskin, who will present, I think, different views, and we'll look for their similarities as well as their differences on how they view the economy. And we will then go to economy session, and then we will have a governance session in the afternoon that will include, I think, which should be a fascinating discussion between Bob Hertzberg and Jim Brulte, moderated by John Myers. So we have an exciting day ahead of us tomorrow, so I hope you all get a good night's sleep. Look forward to seeing you bright and early tomorrow morning here at 8 o'clock. Thank you.